In my family's opulent dining room, I'm the ghost at the table. My name is Daphne Louise, and my family, the people who are supposed to love me, just laughed in my face. My brother, the golden boy, just boasted he's buying a $5.2 million glass mansion. They call my company, my life's work, a cute hobby. They think I'm a failure. They have no idea my hobby cleared $35 million last year. And they certainly don't know that I'm about to buy that house in cash just to see the look on his face. How far would you go to make the people who erased you finally see you? Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. My 10-year-old sedan crunched up the long gravel driveway, the sound offensively loud in the curated stillness of the estate. I dreaded this. Every Sunday, the same knot of acid and anxiety tightened in my stomach, a physical reaction to the psychic weight of my family home. The house itself wasn't a home, it was a statement. A cold Georgian monolith of old money and older expectations, and I was, as always, a disappointment parked out front. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, my fingers gripping the steering wheel. I am Daphne Louise Thorne, 29 years old, founder and CEO of a company that cleared 8 figures last year. I repeated it like a mantra. It never seemed to matter once I stepped through those doors. The massive front door opened before I could knock. My mother, Eleanor Thorne, stood silhouetted against the grand foyer, her posture as rigid as the architecture. "You're late, Daphne." Not "how are you," just a statement of my failing. "Traffic was bad on the 75, I murmured, stepping inside. The air hit me immediately, that sterile, oppressive smell of her expensive lemon-scented furniture polish, and the faint, dusty scent of dried hydrangeas that had been in the same vase for a decade. It was the smell of silence, of things unsaid, of perfection, maintained at all costs. "Sorry, Mom." She just gave a tight nod, her eyes scanning my outfit, a simple but elegant linen dress. "Richard is in the study. Marcus is on his way." She turned her heels, clicking on the marble, and disappeared toward the dining room. I was dismissed. I walked past the study, catching a glimpse of my father, Richard Thorne, his back to me as he stared at a wall of leather-bound books, a glass of scotch in his hand. He was a man obsessed with legacy, a word he used constantly. But legacy only ever meant one thing: his son. I paused in the living room, a place no one ever actually lived in. The fireplace mantel was a shrine to his legacy. There, in heavy silver frames, was Marcus at Yale. Marcus ringing the bell at the NYSE. Marcus shaking hands with a senator. Marcus, Marcus, Marcus. And then, tucked in the far corner, almost hidden behind a carriage clock, was me. A small 5x7 from my high school graduation, my smile painfully awkward. It was the last photo of me they'd ever bothered to frame. I ran a finger over the cold glass. It always felt like I was looking at a ghost. My company, Wren and Reverie, my team of 42 people, the national press, the miracle I had built from clay and grit, none of it existed here. Here I was, just the girl in the small frame, the other Thorne, the hobbyist. The front door burst open, shattering the quiet. "I'm here, Marcus." His voice, always 3 decibels too loud, bounced off the marble. He strode in all charisma and entitlement, pulling Mom into a hug and clapping Dad on the back. At 32, Marcus was the golden boy of Thorne Capital, and he wore his success like a second skin. A tailored suit on a Sunday, a watch that cost more than my car, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "There he is," Dad boomed, his voice alive for the first time. "How's my boy?" "Closing, Dad. Always closing." Marcus laughed, handing his keys to Mom, as if she were the help. Dinner was the usual affair. Dry roast beef, overcooked vegetables, and a heavy judgmental silence broken only by my father and brother discussing a world I was not invited into private equity offshore accounts and the failures of their less talented peers. I sat, ate, and practiced the art of disappearing. I had mastered it by age 12. So, Marcus said, pushing his plate back and draining his wine glass. Big news. I'm finally pulling the trigger on a new place. My mother lit up, her face transformed. Oh, Marcus, where? The glass house on Silverwood, he said, savoring the name. The $5.2 million listing. You know the one. All cantilevered steel and glass overlooking the city. My father put his fork down, his eyes gleaming. Silverwood. My God, that's a statement, son. Exactly, Marcus said, leaning back. It's time. It's a legacy house. Put the offer in this morning. Just contingent on financing, but that's a formality. That's my boy, Richard beamed, raising his glass. Building the legacy brick by brick. A small, stupid pulse of connection flickered in my chest. A desire, even after all these years, to be seen. That's funny, I said, my voice sounding small in the sudden quiet. I've been house hunting too. The silence that followed was absolute. It stretched for 3 long, agonizing seconds. Then my father chuckled. My mother let out a high-pitched titter, and then Marcus the King threw his head back and laughed. A full, booming belly laugh. It wasn't mean. It was worse. It was pitying. The sound of a giant laughing at a mouse. He wiped his eye, his smile a rictus of smug condescension. Oh, sis, that's great. He reached over and patted my hand, a gesture one might give a child. Stick to your pottery. Leave the real estate to the adults, okay? I felt the blood drain from my face. I looked to my mother, but she was just smiling at Marcus, her eyes shining with pride. My father drove the final nail in. It's a cute hobby, Daph, he said, not unkindly, but with the finality of a judge. It keeps you busy, but it's not the real world. I just sat there, my smile frozen on my face, a mask I had worn for 2 decades. The polite, agreeable, invisible daughter. But behind the mask, in the hollow space, where my self-worth should have been something new, was hardening. The humiliation was absolute, a cold, perfect, diamond-hard clarity. It wasn't just that they didn't see me. It was that they refused to. And I was done. I was so done. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't push my chair back or fold my napkin. I just stood up, the dry roast beef tasting like ash in my mouth, and walked out of the dining room. I could feel their eyes on my back, a wave of confused silence, but no one called after me. Why would they? The hobbyist was having a moment. I got into my car, my hands shaking so badly I dropped the keys twice onto the gravel. I jammed the key into the ignition and peeled out of the driveway, my tires spitting rocks. The humiliation was a physical thing, hot and acidic in my throat. I drove not toward my tiny 600-square-foot apartment in Midtown, the one my parents occasionally visited, the one that so perfectly confirmed their narrative of me as the struggling artist, but toward the industrial district by the rail yards. I drove to the place they had never been, the place they didn't even know existed. I parked in my reserved spot and used my fob on the unmarked steel door. The air changed instantly. The oppressive smell of lemon polish and judgment was gone, replaced by the earthy, grounding scent of raw clay, curing American oak, and the faint, sweet perfume of the soy wax for our new candle line. I walked onto the mezzanine overlooking the main floor. Below me, even at 9 p.m. on a Sunday, the night shift was humming. Forklifts, silent as ghosts, moved pallets of finished goods. The massive custom-built kiln, a beast we'd nicknamed Bertha, was glowing in the far corner, its heat radiating even up here. This wasn't a hobby. This was a 30,000-square-foot logistics and production center. This was Ren and Reverie, my sanctuary, my secret. Rough one, huh? I jumped. Leo Ortiz was leaning against my office door holding 2 mugs. He didn't need to ask. He just knew. Leo was my COO, my best friend, the first person who ever saw me as a CEO instead of a familial disappointment. He'd left a six-figure logistics gig at Amazon to join me when I was still packing boxes in my garage, telling me I was a dragon sitting on a mountain of gold who just needed someone to manage the spreadsheets. He was my community. He followed me into my glass-walled office and set the mug of herbal tea on my desk. I was still shaking, the adrenaline of the humiliation thrumming in my veins. "They laughed at me, Leo," I whispered, sinking into my chair. "I said I was house hunting and they laughed." He just nodded, his dark eyes patient. He didn't say who cares. He didn't say they're wrong. He knew this wound. He also knew the truth. He was the one who'd run the final audit last quarter. He knew that my pottery had quietly cleared $35 million in revenue last year. He knew this hobby employed 42 people with full benefits and a 401k matching program. He knew. I stared out at the humming factory floor, but I wasn't seeing it. The memory hit me with the force of a physical blow, as it always did when they cut this deep. It was like a film reel, sudden and sharp. I was 22 again, standing nervously in my father's study, the air thick with the smell of old leather and his pipe tobacco. I was clutching my very first business plan, a 30-page 5-year projection for Ren and Reverie that I had spent 6 months perfecting. My hands had been shaking then too. I'd waited, my heart hammering against my ribs while he'd skimmed it. He hadn't even sat down. He'd flipped through the pages for maybe 30 seconds, his expression bored. Then he'd given me that same pitying pat on the head, the one Marcus had given me tonight. "A lovely hobby, Daphne. Truly. It's good to have a passion." He'd tossed the binder onto his desk, a dismissal. "But Marcus just landed the Goldman internship. That's a career, sweetheart. That's the real world." I had stood there choking on my own dreams, and I'd made a silent vow I would never share my success with them again. I would never give them another piece of my soul to crush. And I never had. Back in my office, the memory faded, leaving behind its familiar, icy sting. But this time, something else was there. The sorrow was still present, a deep, cold ache. But underneath it, something new was crystallizing. The humiliation from an hour ago wasn't just a wound. It was a catalyst. It was the last time. My shaking stopped. I looked up at Leo, and I knew the hollow-eyed girl from the dinner table was gone. The CEO was back. "They think I'm a joke," I said, my voice quiet, but all the tremor was gone. "They think this," I motioned to the bustling warehouse floor, "is a joke." I took a sip of tea and met his gaze, my eyes clear and cold. "Marcus wants the glass house on Silverwood." Leo, bless him, caught the shift instantly. He was already pulling up his laptop, the dim glow illuminating his face. A slow, predatory grin touched his lips. "He does. I just checked the listing. His offer is contingent on financing and a 6-week close. Typical Thorn Capital leveraging." I stood up and walked to the window, pressing my palm against the cool glass, looking down at my factory. My legacy. "Liquidate $6 million from the acquisitions fund," I said. Leo's fingers flew across the keyboard. "Done. Call the listing agent. The real one, Sarah Beth James, not her front office person. Get her private cell. Tell her we are offering $5.5 million all cash. No inspection, no contingencies. We close in 72 hours. And Leo," he looked up, his eyes bright, "it is to be purchased through a new anonymous LLC, R&R Holdings or something. He cannot know my name is on it. He cannot know I was ever in the running. Not yet." Leo's grin widened. "He'll never see it coming." "No," I said, watching a forklift load a pallet of my pottery onto a truck bound for the coast. "He won't." The next 48 hours were a blur. My office became a war room. We didn't sleep. We lived on stale coffee and adrenaline. The thrill of the hunt, the cold, clean precision of the move, replaced all the hot, messy emotions of Sunday night. This was my element. This was where the hobbyist disappeared and the CEO took over. Leo was on the phone, his voice a smooth, confident baritone as he schmoozed with Sarah Beth James, the realtor. He was a master referencing mutual acquaintances from his Amazon days, flattering her, and then with surgical precision dropping the offer. 5.5 Ms. James, all cash. We can wire the earnest money in the next 10 minutes. Our LLC is clean funded and ready to sign. We close in 48 hours. I watched him listen, a small smile playing on his lips. He muted the phone and looked at me. She's sputtering. Says the seller is still reviewing the other offer, Marcus's offer. Tell her the 5.5 expires in 1 hour. I said, not looking up from my laptop, where I was already directing my bank to wire the $500,000 earnest money into our holding account. And tell her we'll go to 5.6, but the offer expires in 30 minutes. And that's our final. You're a shark, Daphne. He grinned, unmuting the phone. Sarah Beth. My apologies, my principal is a very decisive woman. The deal was done in 20 minutes. By Tuesday afternoon, 48 hours after my family had laughed me out of their house, the glass house on Silverwood was mine. The keys were being messengered to the office. I signed the final digital paperwork and felt nothing. Just a cold, quiet click like a lock settling into place. Step 1 was complete. Now, I said, leaning back in my chair, the exhaustion finally hitting me. Just to be safe, I want to know what they're doing. Do a deep dive on Thorn Capital. I want to know what Marcus is really up to. Precaution, Leo asked, already pulling up data terminals I didn't even know we had. Leverage, I replied. They think I'm a child playing with pottery. I want to know exactly what the adults are doing. Leo dug. And I mean, he dug. He worked his contacts, called in favors, and utilized subscription-only financial databases that cost more per year than my first apartment's rent. By evening, he had a file. He slid his laptop across my desk, his expression grim. Daphne, you need to see this. It was a confidential investment prospectus, a pitch deck for Thorn Capital's new $50 million fund. My stomach clenched. And then I saw the target. Apex Home Solutions. I stopped breathing. Apex. They were our largest, most respected competitor. They were based in North Carolina, fiercely independent, and like me, they built their brand on American-made quality and sustainable sourcing. We competed for the same suppliers, the same customers, the same magazine spreads. I respected them. I hated them as a competitor, but I respected them. He's trying to buy Apex, I said, my voice thin. It's worse, Daph, Leo said quietly, pointing to a slide titled Post-Acquisition Strategy. I read the bullet points, and the cold, clean feeling of victory vanished, replaced by a rising tide of ice. Liquidate redundant heritage assets. Consolidate supply chain. Streamline workforce via offshore redundancies. Absorb IP and dissolve core brand. It was a butcher's bill. He wasn't trying to buy Apex. He was planning to gut it. He was going to strip mine it for assets, fire its redundant American workforce, the hundreds of craftspeople and artisans I knew by reputation, and then absorb its supply chain to feed Thorn Capital's other cheaper brands. He was going to murder a great American company, sell its organs, and call it a synergy. And it was all there in cold corporate jargon. The ultimate betrayal settled on me. It wasn't just about the house. It wasn't just the laughter. It was this. He sat at that table and dismissed my pottery, my hobby, my entire life's work, while simultaneously raising $50 million to destroy a company built on the exact same model. He saw the value. He saw the profit. He knew exactly what this industry was worth. He just didn't see it in me. He couldn't stand that I had built it. His little sister. My success was an inconvenient truth that didn't fit his narrative, so he ignored it. But he was more than happy to prey on my community, on my peers, on the very world I had helped build. I looked at Leo, the prospectus glowing on the screen between us. The air in the room felt thin electric. The last shred of sisterly affection, the last tiny, stupid ember of hope that they might one day be proud of me, was extinguished. It was gone, and in its place was a cold, hard vacuum. "He's not just a bully," I whispered, the words tasting like poison. "He's a predator. He's a hyena trying to take down a lion." Leo met my gaze. "What do we do, boss?" I closed the laptop. The click was loud in the silent office. "He wants a war," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "He just doesn't know he's already fighting it." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. My city, my industry. And he's going to lose. The next 2 weeks were a strange bifurcated blur. By day, I was the CEO, deep in negotiations with Leo to counter my brother's predatory moves on Apex Home Solutions. By night, I was an actress, and my performance, as Leo called it, was in full swing. My new project was furnishing the glass house. If my old life had been defined by making myself small and invisible, this new one was about curating the reveal. The house wasn't just a home, it was a stage. I was its sole director. I hired the most sought-after interior designers in Atlanta not to tell me what to do, but to execute my vision with blinding speed. I want it minimalist but warm. I told them, unrolling blueprints on the vast marble island. I want it to feel like a fortress of glass and light. I want every person who walks in here to feel the weight of its success. And at the center of it all, I placed my hobby, the grand foyer with its 30-foot ceiling. We installed a massive 10-foot-tall hand-thrown ceramic sculpture from our Wren and Reverie experimental studio, a piece that had been featured in Architectural Digest. The sprawling dining room. It was set for 30, with a full dinner service of my signature porcelain line, the plates gleaming under a custom chandelier. In the cavernous great room with its sweeping views of the city, our signature line of hand-woven textiles and cashmere throws were draped over furniture that cost more than my father's Mercedes. I was turning the house into an undeniable, inescapable showroom, a monument to the pottery they despised. Then Sunday came again. I went back. I drove the old sedan parked in my usual spot and walked through the lemon-scented foyer. This time the knot of dread was gone, replaced by a cold, humming calm. I was an actress playing her most familiar tired role. I sat at the table, a ghost in my old chair, and I listened. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with the dull knives we used for the roast beef. My mother was picking at her food, my father was silent, and Marcus naturally was ranting. "It's a goddamn insult," he seethed, jabbing his fork in the air, his face ruddy with anger. "I had the offer in. It was my house. And some ghost buyer, some anonymous LLC, swoops in with an all-cash offer, no contingencies, no inspection." He was vibrating with the sheer indignation of it all. "They stole it right out from under me." My father Richard slammed his glass of scotch down, the amber liquid sloshing. "It's this new money trash flooding the city," he growled, his voice low. "No respect for the way things are done. No lineage. My contacts at the bank can't even find out who it is. It's like they don't even exist." I picked up my water glass, my hand perfectly steady. I let my eyes widen, filling them with the practiced, dutiful sympathy of the daughter who didn't understand the real world. "Oh, Marcus, that's awful," I murmured, my voice soft and small. "It was such a beautiful house. Well, I'm sure you'll find something even better." He didn't even look at me. He just scoffed, a short, sharp sound of pure dismissal. "What would you know about it?" he snapped, turning back to my father. "It's the principle of the thing, Dad. They disrespected me." I took a slow, deliberate sip of water, the ice clinking gently against the glass. The taste of victory was so sweet it was almost cloying. I held his gaze for a second, my expression all pity, while inside I was calculating the invitations. The next week, the plan was set. They went out on Monday. Thick, creamy, 800-gram cardstock embossed with a simple, elegant silhouette of the house's famous cantilevered roofline. No host name. Just a time, a date, and an address. You are cordially invited to a housewarming at 110 Silverwood. Leo and I had vetted the guest list ourselves, half of Atlanta's high society, the business elite, and the city's top design critics. And of course, 3 envelopes hand-delivered by courier to the Thorne family estate. My phone rang on Wednesday. My mother. I let it ring twice before picking up, smoothing my voice into its usual passive tone. "Hello, Daphne, darling." Her voice was giddy, sparkling with a social excitement I hadn't heard in years. "Did you get one? An invitation to a party at that very house, the glass house?" "Oh," I said, pretending to be confused as I initialed a purchase order. "I think I did see something, yes." "It must be the new owner," she gushed, completely oblivious. "Someone fabulously wealthy, obviously. Richard is dying to know who it is. We're all going, of course. Marcus is furious he has to go, but he says he needs to see who stole it from him." She paused, and I could practically hear her condescending smile through the phone. "You should come too, dear. It's a perfect chance for you to network with Marcus's friends. Meet some important people." The dramatic irony was so thick I thought I might choke on it. Meet some important people. I looked out my office window at my factory floor, at the empire I had built with my own 2 hands. I smiled, a cold, sharp smile she couldn't see. "You're right, Mom," I said, my voice smooth as silk. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." The glass house was a beacon, just as I'd planned. It sliced through the twilight, a blade of light and steel against the deep blue of the Atlanta skyline. Valets in crisp black uniforms moved like shadows, whisking away Bentleys and Teslas. From the lawn you could hear the thrum of conversation and the clean, complex notes of a string quartet. You could feel the money in the air. It wasn't just the smell of expensive perfume and top-shelf champagne. It was the quiet, dangerous hum of generational power of people who bought and sold legacies before breakfast. And tonight, I was one of them. I moved through the crowd in a gown of emerald silk, a color I'd chosen to stand out. My hair pulled back in a severe, elegant chignon. I was armor-plated. I smiled. I accepted champagne from a passing waiter. I nodded at acquaintances who looked at me with a flicker of recognition. "Isn't that the Thorne girl, the quiet one?" But no one connected me to the house. Why would they? I was just another guest, another satellite in a galaxy of wealth, and I let them believe it. I was a ghost in my own home, and the performance of my life was about to begin. I saw them arrive from my vantage point near the massive 20-foot window. My family. They stepped out of my father's black Mercedes, and for a moment, they just stared. Eleanor. My mother had her hand pressed to her chest, her eyes wide as she took in the sheer scale of the architecture. Richard. My father stood stiffly, his head tilted back, nodding slowly, the impressed, appraising nod of a man calculating another's net worth. And then there was Marcus. He stalked in behind them, a thundercloud of pure envy in a bespoke suit. His eyes weren't filled with awe, they were narrowed, scanning, judging. He was a king inspecting a usurper's castle, poisoned by the fact that it wasn't his. I watched them, my heart a cold, steady drum in my chest. I followed at a distance as they moved through the ground floor. "My God, Richard," Eleanor whispered loud enough for me to hear as she ran a manicured hand along the Italian marble of the entryway. "The cost." Solid investment," Richard murmured, his eyes on the custom light fixtures. "Whoever this is, they're not playing around." Marcus, however, was a running commentary of sour grapes. "Too much glass," he muttered, gesturing with his bourbon. "An absolute nightmare to heat. And this open-plan concept is already dated." He was trying to tear it down, to make it small, to manage the overwhelming cognitive dissonance that someone else had what he wanted. Then they reached the foyer, and they reached my centerpiece. Eleanor stopped dead in her tracks. She moved toward the massive 10-foot ceramic sculpture I'd placed there, the one that had taken my best artisans 6 months to perfect. It was a swirling organic shape of raw power glazed in a deep volcanic black. Eleanor leaned in, her brow furrowed. "Richard, look at this," she said, her voice laced with confusion. "This is It's magnificent. It looks just like one of your pieces, Daphne. I drifted closer, pretending to examine a painting. I saw Marcus roll his eyes, not even giving the sculpture a full glance as he signaled for another drink. Mother, please, he scoffed, his voice dripping with that familiar soul-crushing condescension. This is obviously imported Italian. Look at the craftsmanship. It's flawless. He finally turned, giving me a dismissive glance from across the room. Daphne's stuff is, you know, cute. For a hobby. That was it. The final cut. The last time. I felt the last shred of my old self, the girl who flinched, the girl who made herself small, just turn to dust and blow away. I turned, and on the mezzanine above Leo saw my look. It was the signal. He nodded once, a grim smile on his face, and lifted his champagne flute. Clink, clink, clink. The crystal chime cut through the party's hum. The conversations died. The quartet faded into silence. Ladies and gentlemen, Leo called out, his voice smooth and commanding, filling the cavernous space. Thank you all for coming. Our host, who has been mingling, would like to finally say hello. A ripple of anticipation went through the crowd. This was the moment. The great reveal. Who was the mystery buyer? Who owned this fortress of glass? The crowd parted, creating a natural aisle as hundreds of eyes scanned the room. I saw my father looking toward the door, expecting some tech billionaire to stride in. I saw my mother craning her neck, giddy with the social implications. And I saw Marcus, bored, swirling his bourbon, waiting for the show. I didn't move. I just watched them. And then slowly every eye in the room followed Leo's gaze as he lifted his glass, not to the door, but to the top of the floating glass staircase that dominated the center of the room. I was already there. I hadn't moved. I had been standing at the apex of my own home watching them. The silence was absolute. It was a vacuum. I saw my father's face first, the confusion, the slight tilt of his head as if he couldn't compute the data. I saw my mother's smile freeze, then curdle, her hand fluttering to her pearls. And then I saw Marcus. His head snapped up, his eyes found mine. The bored smirk dissolved. The color drained from his face. We were locked in a silent, screaming tableau, the brother who saw me as nothing, and the sister who had just taken everything. I let the silence stretch, savoring it. I let them all see. I let him see. Then I lifted my own champagne glass in a mock toast. Welcome, everyone. I said, my voice clear, steady, and amplified by the perfect, terrifying acoustics of the room. I looked past the hundreds of guests, past the string quartet, past the empire I had built. My eyes landed on my brother, and I gave him a small, cold smile. Welcome to my house, Marcus. The only sound in the dead, tomb-like silence of the room was the sharp, violent shatter of a bourbon glass hitting the Italian marble floor. The sound of Marcus's breaking glass cracked the frozen silence, and then the party erupted. It wasn't just murmuring, it was a roar. A wave of sound hit me from below, gasps, exclamations, and then applause. It started with one person, a prominent design critic, and spread like fire. This wasn't just a reveal, it was a coronation. The socialites, the old money titans, the tech entrepreneurs, they weren't horrified, they were thrilled. They were witnessing the birth of a new power player and the public humiliation of an old guard bully. The air crackled with it. As I descended the staircase, the silk of my gown whispering against the glass, I was swarmed. People weren't just looking at me. They were seeing me, connecting the dots with lightning speed. Daphne Thorne of Wren and Reverie. A woman from Vogue Living exclaimed, grabbing my hand. My God, that sculpture in the foyer. It is one of yours. It all makes sense. Another man, a venture capitalist I knew by reputation, raised his glass. Wren and Reverie. My wife is obsessed. I had no idea you were a thorn. Or perhaps, he amended with a shrewd look at my father's ashen face. They aren't thorns, you are. My hobby was in an instant the brand of the moment. I smiled, I nodded, I accepted congratulations, and all the while I watched my family. They were an island of silent horror in a sea of celebration. My mother looked faint, her hand gripping my father's arm. My father's face was no longer pale. It was a deep, mottled purple. And Marcus? Marcus was just standing there amidst the shards of his glass, his hands clenched, shaking his eyes, promising murder. They found me by the wine cellar, a temperature-controlled glass cube near the kitchen. I was thanking the caterer when my father's hand clamped down on my elbow. He spun me around his grip, bruising his face inches from mine. "What is this?" he hissed, his voice a low, violent rasp. "What in God's name do you think you're doing? Is this a joke? Where did you get this money?" My mother was right behind him, her face a mask of terrified confusion. "Daphne, tell us. Did you marry someone? Is there a man?" I looked at his hand on my arm until he let go a flicker of shame in his eyes. I straightened my sleeve, my calm and impenetrable shield. "I earned it," I said, my voice cold and clear, cutting through his rage. "From Ren and Reverie, the hobby you told me to quit." I looked past him at my mother's gaping mouth. "We cleared $35 million in revenue last year, Mom. You would have known that if you had ever not once asked me a single question about my life." 35. My father stammered, the number hanging in the air too large for him to process. He couldn't reconcile the daughter he saw with the number I'd just named. Before he could respond, Marcus was there. He pushed past my father, his face white-hot with a fury that went beyond the house. "You!" he spat. He grabbed my other arm harder than my father had. "You did this to spite me. You bought my house to humiliate me." This time I didn't wait. I ripped my arm from his grasp, a sudden violent motion that shocked him into silence. "No, Marcus." My voice was low, lethal. The actress was gone. "You just assumed I couldn't. You never saw me. You looked right through me my entire life. But you're not just blind. You're a predator, and you're trying to do to Apex Home Solutions exactly what you just did to me, erase them." The color drained from his face. The pure adrenalized rage was replaced by a sudden cold dread. He looked small. How do you— What are you talking about?" "The prospectus, Marcus." I said, my voice barely a whisper, but it hit him like a physical blow. "The $50 million fund, strip mining it for assets, offshore redundancies, gutting an American company, my competitor, just to pad your numbers." I leaned in, the smell of his expensive bourbon washing over me. "You're trying to buy my biggest competitor with Dad's money. Did you ever wonder why they've been rejecting your offers for the last 2 weeks? Why they suddenly found a new line of financing?" He stared at me, the calculation happening behind his terrified eyes. He was finally connecting the dots. The anonymous capital that had saved Apex. "That was me," I finished. "You didn't just lose the house, Marcus. You lost the war." He lunged. I don't even think he knew what he was doing. It was a primal, desperate, frustrated roar, his hand raised. But he never touched me. Leo was there, flanked by 2 security guards I'd hired for this very possibility. Leo, my community, caught his wrist in an iron grip. "Mr. Thorne," Leo said, his voice polite but flat as a coffin lid, "I think you and your family should leave." "Get your hands off me," Marcus roared, trying to wrench his arm free. "Out," Leo said, no longer polite. The guards stepped in, one on either side of Marcus. Another gently but firmly took my father's elbow. "You can't do this," my mother shrieked, the sound thin and bird-like. "This is a family matter." "No, Eleanor," I said, watching them be steered toward the foyer. "It's a business one." The party guests gave them a wide berth, a delicious, horrified silence falling as my family was escorted out of my house like common gate crashers. The massive front door closed behind them with a heavy final thud. The string quartet, after a beat, began to play again. The party resumed, the volume even higher, now electric with gossip and my victory. Leo came to my side, handing me a fresh glass of champagne. My community, my friends, my team, my new allies surrounded me, raising a glass to me. Hours later, the last guest was gone. The house was finally completely silent. I stood alone in the cavernous great room looking out at the city lights. The triumph was real. It was sharp and bright. But it was cold. I had won. I had humiliated them. I had taken the house. But as I looked at the coffee table where my copy of the Apex prospectus still sat, I knew this wasn't over. The battle for the house was won. The war for my community, for the soul of my industry, was next. 3 months after the party, the champagne buzz was long gone, replaced by the quiet, satisfying hum of industry. I wasn't in the glass house. I was in my real home, the boardroom of Wren and Reverie, overlooking my factory floor. The party had been the opening salvo. The war was the 3 months that followed. I hadn't just been busy. I'd been surgical. My first act, even before the last champagne flute was washed, was to save Apex. I'd flown to North Carolina, met their terrified CEO, and laid my cards on the table. I didn't come as a conqueror as Marcus had. I came as an ally. I used my capital not to buy them, but to shield them. I extended Wren and Reverie's massive line of credit, providing Apex with the financing they needed to escape Thorn Capital's predatory squeeze. I didn't just block my brother's takeover, I made it impossible. I invested in my community. The result was a new landscape. Wren and Reverie and Apex Home Solutions, once fierce competitors, were now strategic partners. Together we formed an alliance, a united front that effectively controlled the entire American artisanal supply chain. We shared logistics, we co-sponsored new artisan programs, and we locked down the best suppliers from North Carolina to Oregon. We were stronger, faster, and more profitable together. We were a fortress. And Thorn Capital, with its high-leverage strip mine and sell model, couldn't find a crack to get in. We had, in essence, starved them out of the market they'd tried to gut. I was reviewing the projections for our first co-branded holiday line when my private line rang. I rarely used it. Only Leo and my attorneys had the number. But the name on the screen made my blood run cold, not with fear, but with a kind of clinical curiosity. Marcus Thorn. I let it ring twice, then picked up. Daphne. His voice was unrecognizable. The booming, arrogant baritone was gone. In its place was a thin, reedy whisper. He sounded like a child. Daphne, he said again, and I could hear the wet, ragged sound of his breathing. Daphne, please. I said nothing. I just waited. You have to call it off. He stammered, the words tumbling out. The Apex deal. That was our anchor. The investors. They're pulling out. After that party and now this alliance you've built. No one will touch us. He was crying. I could hear it. A choked, pathetic sob. I'm going to be ruined, Daph. Ruined. You're destroying us. I'm running a business, Marcus. I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. Just like you. No, he shrieked, the panic making his voice crack. This isn't business. This is revenge. Dad's money. All of Dad's money is tied up in it. Our money you have to stop. Please. I'll apologize. Whatever you want. The girl from the Sunday dinners, the one who lived on scraps of their approval, was gone. She didn't even feel like a memory. It was never about an apology, Marcus. I said, my emotional clarity a sharp, cold blade. It was never about a price or even that house. It was about respect. You saw a community, a world I helped build, and all you saw was a carcass to strip for parts. You were trying to gut a company, fire its people, and steal its soul, all to make a bonus. That's not business. That's theft. And thieves get caught. I hung up. I didn't slam the phone. I just pressed the button. My hand was perfectly steady. 10 seconds later, my main line rang. My assistant's voice came over the intercom. Ms. Thorne, it's your mother. She sounds frantic. Line 1. I picked it up. It wasn't a voice. It was a wail, a pure, hysterical animal sound of weeping. Daphne, What did you do? What did you do to your brother? Hello, Mother. He's going to lose everything, she shrieked, her words dissolving into sobs. Your father. We co-signed Daphne. We co-signed on his fund to get the last round of investors. We're going to lose the house. Our house. The estate. The word I had been waiting for finally came, the last weapon in her arsenal. Daphne, please, we're family. I looked at the phone. I felt my pulse. Thump, 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 steady as a drum. No adrenaline, no anger, no sorrow, just a flat, calm line of finality. The word family from her lips was just a sound, a desperate, meaningless noise. The power dynamic which had crushed me my entire life had finally completely reversed. I wasn't going to them. They were coming to me. I'll be at my house on Sunday, I said, my voice quiet, cutting through her sobs like a razor. 5 p.m. Come then. I hung up before she could say another word. Sunday, 5 p.m. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long, dramatic shadows across the city and filling my great room with a warm, golden light. I heard the chime of the front gate, and on my security monitor, I watched my old sedan pull up. My father was driving. They hadn't come in the Mercedes. The bank must have already taken it. They looked small and gray on the high-definition screen, 3 ghosts walking up the stone path to my door. They rang the bell. I didn't get up. I had not positioned myself at the top of the staircase for a dramatic reveal. I was not performing for them anymore. I was in the living room, curled on my own sofa under a Wren and Reverie cashmere throw. I was reading a book, and a steaming mug of tea, one of my own designs from a flawed batch I kept for myself, was on the table beside me. I let them wait. I let them stand in the shadow of the house I had built, in the silence, for 3 full minutes. I took a sip of tea. I read to the end of the chapter. Then, and only then, did I press the button to unlock the door. I heard it swing open. I heard their footsteps, hesitant and light, on the marble floor of the foyer. They were aliens here, intruders. Daphne, my mother's voice called out, thin and trembling, echoing in the cavernous space. I said nothing. I just turned a page. They found me huddled together in the entryway to the great room, silhouetted against the blinding floor-to-ceiling sunset. They looked ruined. My father's expensive suit hung on him, his shoulders slumped in a way I had never seen. My mother's eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, her designer handbag held in front of her like a shield. And Marcus. He was hollowed out. The arrogant, charismatic golden boy was gone, replaced by a pale, trembling man with dull eyes who couldn't even look at me. He was staring at the floor. Come in, I said, my voice quiet. I didn't get up. I motioned to the sprawling white sofa opposite me. They sat stiff and awkward, 3 crows perched on a wire. The silence stretched. The only sound was the faint hum of the air circulation and the distant city traffic. This was their meeting. I made them break it. My mother began, her voice a practiced weeping plea. Daphne, you don't understand what you've done. What we've done. We're... She broke, dissolving into a fresh wave of tears, burying her face in her hands. My father, Richard Thorne, the patriarch, the man whose approval I had once craved like oxygen, finally broke. He leaned forward, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. She's right, he said, his voice a hoarse croak. We're losing the house, the estate. It's all gone, tied up in Marcus's fund. He finally looked at me, his eyes desperate, pleading. We're proud of you, Daphne. We are. We just didn't understand. We didn't know. I held his gaze. I felt nothing. No spark of triumph, no surge of pity. Just an ending. I calmly placed a bookmark between the pages and closed the book, the soft thud loud in the quiet room. No, I said, my voice clear, not unkind, but absolute. You weren't proud. You're just broke. I looked at him, at my mother, at the top of my brother's head. You didn't not understand. You didn't listen. You're not sorry for what you did for the last 29 years. You're just sorry for how it ended up for you. My mother's head snapped up, her face ugly with disbelief and fresh tears. So that's it, she cried, her voice rising. You'll just watch as we lose everything, your own family, after all we gave you, all you gave me. I repeated the words, tasting the absurdity of them. I finally stood up, the cashmere throw pooling at my feet. I was no longer the small girl at the dinner table. I was the master of this house, of this life, of myself. I walked not to them, but to the simple, elegant desk I kept in the corner. I opened a drawer, took out my business checkbook, and uncapped a pen. I wrote, my hand perfectly steady. Not for millions. Not to save their legacy. I wrote it only to my parents, Richard and Eleanor Thorne. The amount was $150,000. I tore the check from the book and walked back to them. I held it out. My father just stared at it, uncomprehending. This is for a 2-bedroom condo, I said, my voice quiet but firm. It's for first and last month's rent and a deposit, and enough to live on for 6 months while you figure out what's next. It is the only inheritance you will ever receive from me, and it is infinitely more support than you ever gave me. My father's hand trembled as he reached out and took the check. His eyes, when they met mine, were defeated. He knew it was over. My mother just wept. Then I turned to my brother. Marcus still hadn't moved his shame a physical weight. And Marcus? I said. He flinched but didn't look up. You're a finance wunderkind. You're an adult in the real world. You'll figure it out. I turned and walked to the massive front door, pulling it open. The cool evening air washed into the foyer. I didn't have to say another word. They stood broken and gray and shuffled out. My father, my mother, and my brother. 3 strangers who used to be my family. I didn't watch them get into the car. I didn't watch them drive away. I just closed the door, the heavy final thud echoing in the silence. It was done. The house was quiet. I stood in the foyer for a long time, just breathing. An hour later, I heard a key in the lock. Leo. He came in holding 2 large paper bags of Thai food, the smell of curry and basil filling the sterile air. He looked at me, his eyes kind, searching. You okay? He asked. I turned from him and walked to the great window, looking out at the skyline. My skyline. The lights of the city were just beginning to glitter, sharp and bright as diamonds. A city I had helped build, a city that was finally mine. I wasn't happy. I wasn't sad. I was just still. I took a deep breath, the first one in my entire life that didn't feel tight, that didn't ache. You know, I said, my voice just a whisper, my reflection staring back at me from the glass. For the first time in my life, Leo, I think I am. I was finally completely free. With that final quiet click of the door, Daphne's old life was over, and her new one could finally begin. What did you think of her ultimate victory? We're curious to hear your thoughts in the comments below, and we read every single one. Be sure to subscribe for more. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Ashes of Yesterday. We'll see you next time.